12 Navy SEALs walked into Black Ridge District on Christmas Eve, thinking they were recovering weapons. They were wrong. The intelligence was fabricated, the enemy positions were pre-staged, and the extraction order, denied by the same colonel who sent them in, arrived at 23:47, 60 seconds before the kill signal. Someone inside the command network had just signed their death warrants. On a rooftop 6 blocks away, one woman heard the order. One woman saw the trap closing, and one woman had 90 seconds to decide whether following the rules was worth watching 12 men die. Her name was Maya Vance, and command had spent 2 years trying to forget she existed. If stories like this hit different, subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The briefing lasted 11 minutes. That should have been the first warning sign. Lieutenant Ethan Cole had sat through enough pre-mission intelligence packets to know that 11 minutes meant one of two things. Either the operation was so clean it practically ran itself, or someone had decided the people receiving the briefing didn't need to know everything. This one felt like the second kind. He sat in the third row of Tactical Operations Room B at FOB Kestrel, one folding chair among 12. His team spread around him in the particular way that soldiers arrange themselves when they've worked together long enough. Not assigned seating, not random, just the unconscious gravitational pull of men who trust each other's instincts more than any seating chart. Ryan Maddox sat to his left, the team's senior petty officer, jaw working slowly on a piece of gum he'd been chewing since before they landed in country. Danny Reyes was behind him, and Cole could hear the faint percussion of Reyes tapping 2 fingers against his knee, the thing he always did when he was running scenarios. On the screen at the front of the room, Colonel Victor Halstead stood with the ease of a man who considered his own presence a kind of gift. Black Ridge District, Halstead said, tapping the aerial image with a laser pointer. Downtown sector, approximately 42 city blocks, mixed residential and commercial. In the past 72 hours, our signals intelligence has identified a weapons cache operating out of a 6-story building here. The red dot settled on a structure marked Building 14C, believed to contain stolen military-grade munitions, including man-pads units, and at minimum 2 FIM-92 Stingers. Cole studied the image. The building sat on the corner of 2 streets he didn't have names for, 3 blocks from what the map labeled as an open-air market, 6 blocks from what appeared to be a partially collapsed residential structure. "What's the source on the SIGINT?" Cole asked. Halstead looked at him with the mild patience of a man indulging a question he considered beneath his time. "Multiple confirmed human assets in the area, corroborated by signals intercepts." Multiple assets or one asset corroborated by signals. A beat. "The intelligence is solid, Lieutenant." Cole nodded once and said nothing else. He filed it, put it in the drawer in the back of his head where he kept the things that didn't add up yet. The rest of the briefing moved at the same pace. Ingress route. 3 vehicles. Civilian pattern. Enter via Route 7 from the southern checkpoint. Objective. Locate, document, and extract the weapons cache. Rules of engagement. Standard, weapons-free only on confirmed hostile. Exfil. Vehicle convoy back through southern checkpoint upon mission completion. 11 minutes. No questions answered that he hadn't already asked. No intelligence packet to review afterward. No indication that anyone on his team would not be coming home. The vehicles left FOB Kestrel at 22:30. Christmas Eve had arrived the way it always did in a war zone. Without decoration, without ceremony, bringing only the particular weight of knowing people elsewhere were doing something else. Cole sat in the second vehicle, a battered Toyota Land Cruiser with civilian plates and a cracked rear window that someone had patched with clear packing tape. Maddox was in the front passenger seat. Reyes and 3 others were jammed in the back. Nobody talked much. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the feeling in the truck, a specific quiet that Cole had learned to recognize over the years, the kind that settled over a team when their instincts were sending a message their conscious minds hadn't caught up to yet. Reyes broke it first. "The SIGINT," he said. "Colonel ever say what frequency band?" "He did not," Cole said. "Building 14C is 3 stories taller than anything within 2 blocks. Manpad storage in a corner building with 4 ground-level access points." "I know." That's a terrible place to store man pads. I know, Danny. Just saying. I know you're just saying. Maddox turned from the front seat. We doing this? We're doing this, Cole said, but we're doing it careful. Reyes, I want you on comms the whole time. Any change in traffic patterns, any signal anomalies, you tell me. Copy. And nobody goes anywhere alone. 2-man minimum every room. Looser than usual, Maddox observed. The ROE is looser than usual too, Cole said. That doesn't mean we are. The convoy moved deeper into the city. The streets narrowed. The lighting changed. Fewer working street lamps, more darkness between buildings, more shadows pooling in doorways. The commercial district gave way to something grittier, streets layered with the accumulated sediment of a neighborhood that had been fought over more than once and showed it. Walls carried old scorch marks. Windows were boarded or missing entirely. A burned-out car sat on its rims at the edge of an intersection, and someone had painted something on its hood in red that Cole didn't have time to read. Coming up on the outer perimeter, said the driver, a JSOC liaison named Grayson, who Cole had worked with twice before. 4 minutes out. Cole keyed his radio. Alpha 9, this is actual. Comms check. The responses came back in order. Clean, clear, 12 voices confirming 12 positions. He did the count in his head as they always did. Not because he didn't trust the radio, but because hearing each voice was a thing he needed, a kind of verification that existed before technology and would outlast it. He got to 12. He breathed. They set up at the building's eastern approach at 2311. The structure matched the aerial imagery. 6 stories, corner placement, fire escapes on 2 sides, loading dock at the rear. Cole stood in a recessed doorway across the street and watched it for 3 full minutes before he moved. Nothing moving in the windows. No visible guards at the entrance. Ground-level access looked clear. That was wrong. A building supposedly storing weapons that could take down aircraft should have had at least a perimeter watch. Even an amateur operation put someone at the door. You seen what I'm seeing? Maddox murmured beside him. Empty, Cole said. Too empty. Reyes. Still working, Reyes said from 2 feet away, eyes down on the signals equipment. I'm getting something. Encrypted traffic, but it's fragmented, running a decode now. How long? 2 minutes. We don't have 2 minutes. Halstead's timeline has us on entry by 23:15. Then we're going to be late, Reyes said flatly, because I'm not going in blind. Cole looked at him. In 14 months of working together, Reyes had said something like that exactly once before, during an operation in a city whose name Cole had been told not to write down. He'd been right then, too. Okay, Cole said. 2 minutes. He used the time to look at the street, really look at it the way he'd been trained to. Not at the obvious elements, but at the negative space, the gaps, the things that weren't where they should be. A city block had a rhythm. Parked cars, dumpsters, foot traffic patterns, ambient noise. When that rhythm broke, you could feel it before you could name it. Something was wrong with the cars. He counted 5 vehicles parked along the block in front of Building 14C. 3 to the east, 2 to the west. Normal enough distribution for this time of night. But the cars to the east were all angled slightly, maybe 10 degrees, with their front ends pointed outward, away from the curb, not parked, staged. Maddox, he said quietly. Yeah. The vehicle's on the east side. A pause. Staged. That's what I'm seeing. Blocking position? Or a funnel? Gets us moving west when things go loud. Cole felt the cold settle into his chest. Not fear exactly, but the thing adjacent to it, the hyper-awareness that preceded bad outcomes. Reyes, what do you have? I have... Reyes stopped. The silence stretched 2 full seconds. Cole, tell me. The encrypted traffic. It's not insurgent pattern. Another pause. It's coordinated tactical communication, multiple nodes. These people are talking to each other like a military unit. The cold in Cole's chest spread. How many nodes? Minimum 8, could be more. They're layered. Reyes looked up, and in the darkness, his face was a careful blank. The expression of a man controlling what he let show. They knew we were coming. Cole was already reaching for his radio to call an abort when the static hit. A burst of white noise that lasted half a second and then cleared, and Colonel Victor Halstead's voice came through the command channel. Alpha 9, this is Overlord Actual. You are cleared for entry. Move to objective. Cole keyed back. Overlord, Alpha 9 Actual. We're reading coordinated tactical traffic in the target area, requesting 30-minute delay for pattern confirmation. A pause. 3 seconds, 5 seconds. Alpha 9, you are on a time-sensitive objective. Proceed as ordered. Overlord, I'm advising Lieutenant Cole. Halstead's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. You have your orders. Cole held the radio for a moment. Overlord copies, he said. Then, off-channel, to his team. Abort to the secondary position. Nobody moves until I... His radio erupted. Not static. Not interference. Gunfire, translating through the earpiece of the man on point 50 meters to the south. Contact, Torres's voice, tight and controlled. East side, 3 o'clock, multiple. Then the night lit up. Mom. The first burst came from the building across the street. A window on the 4th floor that had looked empty 3 minutes ago and now had a muzzle flash strobing at 4-round intervals. Cole hit the ground and rolled left by pure instinct, putting a concrete retaining wall between himself and the incoming. Rounds struck the wall above him, not random, not suppressive, aimed, and he registered that information without fully processing it yet, just filed it, kept moving. Alpha 9, northwest corner, Maddox's voice in his ear. They're coming around the back. Reyes, sit rep. 4 positions confirmed, possibly 6. East building, rooftop on the south, 2 ground-level gun positions bracketing the loading dock. A burst of static. They're trying to cut us off from the exfil route. Cole came up behind the wall, assessed the street in 1 second. Torres and his partner Hendricks had taken cover behind one of the staged vehicles. Not the best choice, but what they had. 2 other team members, Walsh and Kim, were pinned in the recessed loading dock with limited arc. The remaining 8 were scattered between him and a position 30 meters north that offered better cover but worse angles. Alpha 9, collapse northwest, he called. Bound by pairs, I'll anchor. Walsh is hit, Kim's voice. Shoulder. He's mobile, but... Get him moving, Kim, go! Cole came around the low wall with his rifle up and laid 3 controlled pairs toward the 4th floor window, not expecting to hit, expecting to make someone flinch. The muzzle flash suppressed for 2 seconds. It was enough. Torres and Hendricks were moving. The firefight had the particular texture of an ambush, not the chaos of a meeting engagement, but something more organized, more patient. The incoming fire wasn't trying to overwhelm them immediately. It was hurting them. Every time Cole's team tried to move toward a gap, fire would shift to close it. Funneling. They were being funneled north, away from the exfil route, deeper into the block. Overlord Alpha 9, Cole called into the radio, still moving. We are engaged, multiple enemy positions, requesting immediate CAS and exfil coordination. Halstead's voice came back without hesitation. Alpha 9, hold your position. Exfil is being coordinated. We cannot hold position, Overlord. We are being pushed. Alpha 9. A pause. Hold position and await further instruction. Cole released the transmit key. Maddox appeared at his shoulder, breathing hard. He's not sending anybody. Not yet. Cole, Maddox's voice dropped. I've been in 14 of these. He's not sending anybody. Cole looked at him. The exfil route we came in on, Maddox said, is 2 blocks south. We could make it in 4 minutes with cover. We'd be running through a kill zone without air support. We'd be running, as opposed to standing still in a trap. Another burst of fire from the south. Kim's voice called something on the secondary channel that Cole couldn't quite make out. He looked at the street, looked at the building, looked at the staged vehicles, still sitting in their blocking positions, exactly where they'd been, as if this entire geography had been preset for this exact moment. His radio came to life again. Colonel Halstead's voice. Calm. Even. The voice of a man giving the exact order he intended to give. Alpha 9. Extraction is denied. Hold position and await further instruction. Denied. Not delayed. Not coordinated. Denied. The word landed in the space between Cole's ribs and stayed there. He looked at Maddox. Maddox looked back. Neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to say. Nothing that didn't come out the other end of that silence already understood. Somewhere in the city, in a direction Cole couldn't see and hadn't yet identified, something was very wrong with the people who were supposed to be keeping them alive. 6 blocks away, on the 3rd floor of a building that didn't appear on any American military map, a woman lay flat on a concrete surface and watched 12 men begin to die. Maya Vance had been in Blackridge District since 1400. She'd come on her own authority, which was to say she'd come without any authority at all, which was to say she'd violated the terms of her current administrative status, grounded pending review, restricted to FOB Kestrel, under investigation for an incident 3 weeks prior that her chain of command had described as dangerous insubordination and that she described privately as keeping 4 Marines alive. She had her rifle, her scope, her radio set to a frequency that wasn't supposed to exist on any official comms architecture. And she had, as of approximately 20 minutes ago, a very clear understanding of what was about to happen to Alpha 9. Through her thermal scope, she watched the firefight below with the detached precision of someone who had spent 8 years learning to see chaos and reduce it to geometry. She tracked the positions, the movement patterns, the fire discipline of the enemy units. She identified the coordinating nodes, the fighters who weren't shooting but were moving, relaying hand signals, redirecting pressure. This wasn't an ambush by insurgents who'd gotten lucky with some intelligence. This was a tactical operation run by people who knew how to run tactical operations. She'd picked up the encrypted traffic 3 hours ago, running a passive intercept she wasn't supposed to be running on equipment she wasn't supposed to have in a location she wasn't supposed to be in. The decode had taken 90 minutes. What it gave her was not a complete picture, but enough of one. 12 targets. Elimination before midnight. No survivors, not captures, not exploitation for intelligence value. Elimination. She'd spent the next hour trying to figure out if she was wrong, building the case against her own interpretation, because that was the discipline. You didn't act on an incomplete read. You verified. You checked the secondary indicators. You waited until the picture was clear enough that doubt wasn't a luxury you could afford. The picture was clear. She pressed her eye to the scope and found the rooftop sniper she'd identified 12 minutes ago. A position on the southern building, elevated, good angles on the eastern approach. He hadn't fired yet. That told her something. He was waiting for the team to funnel north. He was the cleanup position, the one who'd take the team apart once they were channeled into the kill zone. She moved her scope back to the street. Cole's team was still fighting, still coherent, but the pressure was building from 3 sides now. Walsh was moving with his left arm pressed against his side. One of the others, she couldn't get a clear ID from this angle, had gone to ground behind a burned concrete divider that offered questionable protection. Her radio gave a soft tone. She pressed the earpiece tighter and listened. Colonel Halstead's voice came through the encrypted channel that nobody at FOB Kestrel knew she'd cracked. He wasn't talking to the command network. He was talking to someone else. She listened for 43 seconds. Then she understood everything. She had 90 seconds before the final signal went out. 90 seconds before the coordinated attack would overwhelm what remained of Alpha 9's defensive perimeter. 90 seconds before 12 men died on Christmas Eve in a war zone. Their deaths written off as enemy action, their knowledge erased, their names added to a list of casualties that no investigation would examine too carefully. Maya Vance removed her eye from the scope. She took one breath. She pressed her eye back. The rooftop sniper was acquiring his first target. Her finger found the trigger, and her radio came alive one more time. Halstead's voice back on the command channel, the voice of a man who believed he was untouchable, giving the order he'd planned all along. Alpha 9 extraction denied, hold position. Chat. Below, in the street, Ethan Cole heard those words land like a door closing. He pressed his back against the concrete wall. He looked at his team. 11 men in various states of cover, one of them hurt, all of them fighting, all of them trusting that somewhere above the chaos, someone was working on getting them out. He keyed his radio. Overlord, Alpha 9, say again your last. Extraction denied, Lieutenant. Hold position. Cole lowered the radio. In the corner of the street, Ryan Maddox met his eyes and didn't look away. 12 men, surrounded, extraction denied, Christmas Eve. And somewhere in the command structure, Cole didn't know where yet, someone had just decided that none of them were supposed to leave Blackridge District alive. The intelligence picture Delaney had been working from was missing 14 minutes of signals data, not corrupted, not lost to transmission error, missing in a way that was clean and deliberate. A 14-minute gap that began exactly when the flanking element entered the drainage culvert and ended exactly when they would have been close enough to the extract route that any competent analyst reviewing the raw feed would have flagged it immediately. Someone had trimmed the package before it reached Delaney. Maya sat with that for a long time in the secondary intelligence annex, in the particular silence of a room with no windows and fluorescent lighting that buzzed at a frequency just below conscious awareness. She sat with it the way she sat with a difficult shot, not rushing the conclusion, letting the picture settle, letting the variables resolve themselves into something she could act on with confidence. Then she pulled the previous operation, the one before the Marine Recon mission, a 6-man Special Forces element 2 months prior. Patrol ambushed in a sector that intelligence had assessed as low threat. 2 men killed, one with injuries that ended his career. The after-action report attributed the failure to bad luck and degraded enemy pattern of life analysis. Maya pulled the raw SIGINT from that operation. Another gap. 11 minutes this time. She pulled the one before that. 9-minute gap. The gaps weren't identical in length or position, but they shared a structural similarity. Each one occurred at the precise window that would have given the field element actionable warning of the threat they walked into. Each gap had been present in the sanitized intelligence package delivered to the mission commander. Each gap was absent from the raw feed, which meant the raw feed had been intact when it came in and had been altered somewhere in the processing chain before distribution. Someone with access to the intelligence pipeline was editing the packages. Not randomly, selectively, surgically, removing exactly the data that would have kept soldiers alive. Maya built a spreadsheet on a personal encrypted drive she kept in the lining of her kit bag. She wasn't supposed to be building spreadsheets on classified data from a terminal she wasn't supposed to be accessing, but the policy violation felt considerably less important than the pattern she was assembling. 8 operations over 14 months. 8 operations where the intelligence package delivered to the field element was materially different from the raw feed in ways that consistently disadvantaged the people on the ground. 8 operations where soldiers died or were seriously wounded in situations that better intelligence would have allowed them to avoid. She cross-referenced every variable she could identify: geographic area, unit type, time of year, mission classification level, supporting assets, requesting command node, approving authority. Most variables showed no consistent pattern. One did. Every compromised operation fell under the operational authority of the same command node, Task Force Kestrel. Colonel Victor Halstead's command. She hadn't gone to her immediate superior with what she'd found. That calculation took her approximately 4 minutes and was not difficult. Major Glenn Torrance had been at FOB Kestrel for 9 months and had, in Maya's assessment, spent most of those 9 months working to make sure Colonel Halstead thought well of him. Torrance wasn't corrupt in the conventional sense. He wasn't taking money, wasn't operating from personal malice, wasn't the kind of officer who woke up in the morning looking for ways to do harm. He was something more dangerous. A man whose primary tactical instinct over 20 years of service had calcified into institutional self-preservation. He had learned early that the path to longevity ran through senior officers' approval, and he had refined that lesson into something that looked like competence, but was actually a sophisticated, well-practiced loyalty to whoever held rank above him. Bringing Torrance evidence against Halstead would be like handing a lit match to someone whose primary concern was not burning themselves. She considered going higher, above Halstead, to theater command, but that required a documented case that would take weeks to build through proper channels. And proper channels were already being monitored by someone who had demonstrated both the access and the willingness to make inconvenient data disappear. Going above Halstead through the system Halstead had compromised was not a solution. It was a notification. So she kept working. Quietly. Carefully. She added data points, documented the timeline, built the case from the inside out, working the gaps backward through the processing chain, identifying the access logs that showed who had touched each intelligence package and when. The access logs themselves were partially redacted, standard at that classification level, but metadata wasn't, and metadata told its own story. Timestamps, terminal IDs, session durations. The digital shape of someone moving through a system, even with their identity masked, left marks the way footsteps left impressions in soft ground. You couldn't always name the foot, but you could measure the stride. She was 3 weeks into this when she intercepted something she wasn't looking for. A signals burst. Encrypted, short duration, riding a frequency band that had no legitimate use in the current operational framework. The kind of transmission profile designed to look like background noise to anyone running a standard intercept sweep. She almost missed it. She would have missed it 2 years ago, but she'd spent enough time in the electronic environment of FOB Kestrel to know what the baseline sounded like, and this was wrong in the specific way that only deliberate things were wrong. She logged it, ran a passive capture, spent 4 days working the encryption with tools she had built herself from components that were individually innocuous and collectively something her chain of command definitely would not have approved. When it cracked, she had 11 seconds of audio, a voice she recognized immediately, the particular cadence of authority that didn't need to raise itself to be heard, measured, patient, certain of its own weight. Halstead. The 11 seconds was a fragment, a piece of a longer transmission she'd only partially captured, but she caught enough. A reference to a designation she didn't recognize, longbow, a reference to a schedule, a reference to a phrase she had to play back 3 times before she was certain she'd heard it correctly, confirm elimination window. She sat in the secondary intelligence annex for a long time after that. Then she went back to her quarters and spent 2 hours doing something she hadn't done in a long time. She sat on the edge of her bunk in the dark and let herself be uncertain. Let herself run every alternative interpretation she could construct. Let herself build the strongest possible case for being wrong, because being wrong about this, about a colonel coordinating the deaths of American soldiers, was not a recoverable error. It was the kind of wrong that ended careers and freedom, and depending on how it played out, potentially more than either. She could not make herself wrong. Every interpretation, even the most charitable ones, led back to the same place. Halstead was coordinating with someone outside the command network. The coordination was operational in nature, and the phrase elimination window had one meaning in a tactical context, and it was not ambiguous. She started watching Halstead directly after that. The watching was difficult because her restrictions kept her on the FOB, but FOB Kestrel was not large, and a woman who had spent 8 years learning to observe without being observed could do considerable work within a confined space. She watched his patterns, his meetings, the people he sought out, and the ones he managed without warmth. She paid attention to his communications habits, when he used the standard network, when he stepped outside the installation's internal monitoring range to use his personal encrypted satellite device. She couldn't access the satellite device. That gap in her capability was real, and she couldn't close it from where she stood. But she could watch who he met in person, and one person appeared more frequently than the stated professional relationship between them could justify. A signals officer, Captain Reed Sowers, attached to FOB Kestrel for 6 months, with an official role in communications infrastructure management. Sowers and Halstead met 3 times in a single week, during which Maya could identify no operational requirement for their collaboration. The meetings were brief, never in the TOC, never in spaces covered by the installation's internal camera network, always in the peripheral geography of the FOB, where the foot traffic was light and the sight lines were short. She added Sowers to her documentation. Then, 10 days before Christmas Eve, she intercepted a second burst, longer, 26 seconds. Same encryption architecture as the first intercept, which meant her tools cracked it faster. This time, she got enough to understand the shape of what she was hearing. A mission, a specific team, a specific date. The team designation was corrupted in the capture, but she had the date, and she had enough contextual material to understand that, whatever Longbow was, it involved using a legitimate operational mission as the cover mechanism for something that would not appear in any official brief. She began trying to identify which team was being targeted. She was still working on it when the tasking order for Alpha 9's Christmas Eve operation crossed the intelligence distribution system 3 days later. She pulled the raw SIGINT package that had generated the mission within 20 minutes of it appearing in the system and found what she'd expected to find. The enemy tactical picture in Blackridge District was considerably more complex than what was being presented in the sanitized version that Lieutenant Cole would receive in a briefing whose length, 11 minutes, she noted when she reviewed the TOC's schedule, was itself a form of information. The enemy units in Blackridge weren't insurgents with a static weapons cache in a corner building. They were organized in a way that insurgents protecting a cache did not organize. Their communications discipline was inconsistent with irregular forces. Their positioning, the specific geography of it, the way their elements related to each other across the 6-block operational area, made no tactical sense for defending a fixed site. It made complete sense for containing and eliminating a small force with no exit. Maya spent 40 minutes building her case against herself one more time, running the alternative reads, stress testing every assumption, looking for the interpretation that didn't end with a colonel running a murder operation against his own people. She couldn't find it. At 13:47 on December 24th, she packed her rifle and her signals equipment into a civilian bag, told the corporal manning the secondary intelligence annex that she was going to the mess hall, and walked off FOB Kestrel through a gap in the perimeter fence she had identified 3 weeks earlier and had been keeping in reserve for a situation she'd hoped would never require it. The building she'd chosen was a former commercial storage facility, 3 stories, solid concrete, windows on the north and east faces that gave her overlapping sight lines across the 6-block area where Alpha 9 would operate. She was in position by 14:30, which gave her 9 hours to watch the enemy move into place. She watched them for all 9 hours, and they were good. She acknowledged it without pleasure. They moved in small elements, 2s and 3s, filtering through the district across the afternoon in a way that would read as normal urban traffic to any surveillance asset not specifically looking for a pattern. They established communications nodes first, then blocking positions, then fire positions. The sequence was professional. Whoever had planned this had planned it carefully, with knowledge of how American tactical elements operated, knowledge of the specific unit's movement habits, knowledge of the timeline down to the quarter hour. That kind of knowledge didn't come from open source collection. It came from inside. The rooftop sniper on the southern building arrived at 21:15 and spent 45 minutes establishing his hide with the patience of someone who had done this before and understood the difference between a good position and a position that looked good. He picked the right spot. She noted his location with the professional detachment of someone taking inventory, and she began constructing the sequence she would need to run when the time came. If the time came. She still wanted it not to come. She spent an hour during the long wait building the scenario in which Alpha 9 arrived, read the situation, called an abort, and extracted before the trap closed. It was a clean scenario. Nobody died. Nobody had to make the decision she was sitting on the edge of making. She filed it in the part of her mind reserved for outcomes she preferred but couldn't control, and she went back to watching. At 23:11, Alpha 9 established their approach position across from Building 14C. Through the thermal scope, she watched Cole in the recessed doorway. His stillness, his attention, the way he was looking at the street with the particular quality of someone whose instincts were already sending a message. She watched him find the staged vehicles on the east side, watched the subtle shift in his stance that most people would have missed, watched him turn to Maddox and say something she couldn't hear from this distance. He knew. Or he was close to knowing. She tuned to the command frequency and listened to Halstead clear Alpha 9 for entry with the smooth authority of a man executing a plan. She listened to Cole push back. Carefully, professionally, the way a good officer pushed back when something was wrong and the system required him to do it through channels. She listened to Halstead deflect each objection with the language of a man who had already made his decision and was simply managing the interval before it executed. Then the shooting started, and the geometry she'd spent 9 hours constructing became the only thing between 12 men and the outcome that had been designed for them. She tracked the firefight through the scope with a kind of focused anguish, watching positions she'd already mapped, watching fire patterns she'd already predicted, watching Cole's team compress northward exactly as the enemy plan required. Walsh going down partial, shoulder, still mobile. Cole coordinating his people with the controlled efficiency of someone who was very good at his job and was working with the specific disadvantage of not knowing that the danger was not only in the street below him, but in the command channel feeding orders into his ear. The rooftop sniper settled behind his rifle. She checked the command frequency one more time. Halstead's voice, arriving with the weight of something that had been decided long before tonight. Alpha 9? Extraction denied. Hold position. She moved her eye back to the scope. The sniper on the southern rooftop was adjusting his position, coming off his initial angle, tracking right, acquiring a new target. She moved with him, identified his line of sight, followed it down to the street. Cole. Cole was moving between positions in a pattern the sniper had read, and in approximately 25 seconds, he would be in a window. 3 seconds of exposure, maybe 4, that the man on the roof had been waiting for since 21:15. On her intercept equipment, a new transmission broke through the secondary channel. 2 voices. Halstead. Final window is confirmed. Signal when the perimeter is sealed. Unknown voice. Copy. 8 minutes. 8 minutes. She had worked alone in difficult situations before. She had made calls that cost her professionally, calls that she'd had to stand behind in rooms full of people who had already decided she was wrong before she finished explaining why she wasn't. She understood what it meant to act without authorization, and she understood what it cost. And she had spent the last 3 weeks watching the cost of inaction accumulate across 8 operations and the bodies they'd left behind. She settled her breathing. Wind from the northwest, 8 to 12 kilometers per hour, call it 10, adjust 2 clicks right on the elevation and allow a half correction left on the windage. Distance to the rooftop, 340 meters. The sniper was partially shielded by a low parapet. She had head and upper torso enough. Below, Cole transitioned between positions. The sniper's rifle tracked. Maya stopped thinking about authorization. Stopped thinking about her record, her case, her future at FOB Kestrel, the board that was waiting to review her, the career that had been quietly dismantled over the past 2 months by a man who needed her silent and sidelined. She thought about 12 men. She thought about the 14-minute gap in Delaney's intelligence package. She thought about elimination window. She exhaled slowly, halfway, and held it. Her finger settled on the trigger with the familiarity of something she'd done so many times it had become a physical language, a vocabulary her body spoke without translation. The rooftop sniper's rifle steadied on Cole. Maya fired. The shot broke clean. She was already cycling, already moving to the next position in her sequence. The RPG operator in the ground floor of the abandoned structure on the north end, 60 meters farther. Wind constant. Angle dropping 7 degrees. She found him in 2 seconds. He was raising the tube, muzzle tracking toward the densest cluster of Alpha 9's defensive position. Second shot. He went down hard, and the tube dropped, and she was already moving again. Third target. The communications runner she'd watched for 9 hours. The man who connected the enemy commander to his team leaders, currently moving between 2 positions along the west face of the block. He went still before he reached the second position. She was breathing steadily. Her body was doing the work it had been trained to do, the work that had made command uncomfortable in ways they'd disguised as disciplinary concerns. She worked the sequence with the systematic focus of someone dismantling a mechanism. Not in anger, not in fear, not with anything that would compromise the geometry. Below, the shape of the firefight began to change. The enemy fire patterns fractured. Without the communications runner, the team leaders were making independent decisions, and independent decisions in a coordinated operation created gaps. Cole's people felt it. She could see the shift in their movement, the first moment of something that wasn't quite hope, but was adjacent to it, the tactical recognition that the pressure had changed. She didn't stop. The sequence had 11 elements. She worked them in the order she had determined, the order that would collapse the operational structure most efficiently, targeting the coordinating nodes over the trigger pullers because cutting the nervous system was more effective than cutting the hands. By the time she reached Element 7, the enemy units had begun to lose coherence. Element 8 broke a blocking position that had been cutting Cole's team off from the northern route. Element 9 was the enemy commander himself, the man who had been running this operation from a setback position for 3 hours, patient and certain, watching his plan execute. He was still watching when she found him. He was not watching after. She paused, checked her intercept equipment. The encrypted tactical traffic between enemy elements had dropped to a fraction of its earlier volume. Confused, without coordination, the communications pattern of a force that had lost its command structure. Below, the firefight was still going, but it was different now. The enemy was reactive, not deliberate. They were fighting because they were still present, not because they were executing a plan. The plan was gone. Cole's voice came over the command frequency, tight, controlled, calling his people, reading the changed situation. She heard him identify the shift, heard Maddox confirm it, heard the team begin to move with a different kind of purpose. She pulled her personal radio, the one she'd brought from FOB Kestrel, set to a frequency outside the standard tactical architecture, and keyed it. She needed to give them a route. But first she needed to transmit something else, something that couldn't be recalled, couldn't be deleted, couldn't be trimmed from any intelligence package after the fact. She pulled the recording device from her kit, the one that had been running on the secondary intercept channel since she'd arrived at this position 14 hours ago. 26 hours of audio, including Halstead's voice on the encrypted channel that wasn't supposed to exist, including the 2 transmissions she'd intercepted, including, from 40 minutes ago, the voice confirming the final window. She pulled the transmission protocol she'd built 3 weeks ago on the encrypted drive in her kit bag, an output that would route to 3 separate recipients simultaneously, one outside the theater command structure, one at an agency level that Halstead's operational authority didn't touch, one to a legal address that she had spent a week identifying as genuinely independent of the command network she was operating inside. The transmission took 11 seconds. Then it was gone. She keyed her personal radio. Alpha 9, this is Vance. Northeast corridor is open. Building 14C to the alley on your left, 40 meters to the vehicle access road. Move now. A pause. 3 seconds. Cole's voice came back. Careful. Assessing. Who is this? Someone who's been watching this longer than you have. She was already starting to break down her position, moving with practiced efficiency. The command structure that sent you in is compromised. Your exfil through Overlord is not coming. Northeast corridor, 40 meters. You have about 4 minutes before someone reorganizes down there. Another pause. Why should I trust you? It was a fair question. It was the right question. She appreciated that he asked it instead of either complying automatically or dismissing her outright. Because the sniper who had you in his sights 6 minutes ago isn't breathing anymore, she said. And because the RPG that would have ended your whole team's night is sitting in the street with nobody behind it. She shouldered her kit. I'm not asking you to trust me, Lieutenant. I'm asking you to move. The longest 4 seconds of the night passed. Alpha 9, Northeast corridor. Cole's voice came over his team channel. Bound by pairs. Maddox, you've got rear. Move. Maya was already gone from the window. She moved through the building's interior with her hand on the wall in the dark, navigating by the mental map she'd built during the hours before sunset, heading for the stairwell that would take her to ground level and the extraction route she'd planned for herself. Separate from Alpha 9's because arriving at the same point at the same time created problems she didn't need, and because what came next was going to be complicated enough without adding a reunion to it. In the street below, she could hear the firefight continuing to lose coherence, sporadic now, individual shots rather than coordinated patterns, the sound of a plan dissolving. On her intercept equipment, she caught one final transmission on Halstead's encrypted channel. Not Halstead's voice this time, the unknown voice, shorter than before. The specific brevity of someone delivering bad news to a person who does not receive it well. Longbow is compromised. We have a problem. She did not stop moving. She was 3 floors up in a dark building in Blackridge District on Christmas Eve, administratively sanctioned, operating without authorization, in possession of evidence that was currently transmitting itself to people who could act on it. And somewhere on the other side of the city, in a command post that was about to get very loud, a colonel who had spent 2 months trying to make her irrelevant was about to discover that he had badly miscalculated the specific kind of irrelevant she was. She hit the ground floor and pushed through the exterior door into the cold air. She had done what she came to do. What happened next was out of her hands. And also, she understood with the particular clarity that came after action, entirely inevitable. The cold hit her the moment she cleared the exterior door. She moved left along the building's outer wall, staying tight to the concrete, her kit riding high on her back and her rifle broken down to its carry configuration. Barrel separated, stock folded, the whole assembly in a configuration that was faster to reassemble than most people assumed, and slower than she would have liked given what the next few minutes might require. The alley behind the storage facility ran south for 40 meters before opening onto a cross street that would give her access to the route she'd mapped 3 days ago. A path back toward the FOB's outer perimeter that avoided the main checkpoints and used the drainage infrastructure on the eastern side of the district. She was 20 meters down the alley when her intercept equipment gave a tone. She stopped. The tone wasn't an alert she'd programmed. It was a frequency hit. The passive scanner picking up a transmission on a band she'd flagged, but hadn't expected to activate tonight. She pulled the receiver from her kit and checked the display in the dark, shielding the screen with her body. The frequency was the one Sowers used. Captain Reed Sowers, Halstead's signals officer, whose meetings with the colonel had never appeared on any official calendar, and whose professional relationship with the operation running in Black Ridge District tonight had been, until this moment, something Maya could prove circumstantially but not directly. She pressed the earpiece in and listened. Sowers' voice, clipped and moving fast. "We have an unknown shooter in the operational area. Enemy command element is down. Longbow is unraveling." A pause. Then Halstead, and his voice was different now. Not the measured patience she'd heard all evening, not the smooth deflection of a man managing a timeline. Something underneath the surface of it had shifted. The control was still there, but it was working harder than it had been. "Confirm the transmission intercept." "Confirmed. Someone ran an output about 4 minutes ago. Triple destination routing. I'm seeing the addresses, but I can't block it. It's already gone." Silence. 4 seconds of it. "Can you identify the source terminal?" "Working on it. The routing architecture it's not standard. Whoever built this knew what they were doing." Another silence, shorter. "Find them," Halstead said, "and shut down the Alpha 9 channel. I don't want Cole talking to anyone outside this network until we understand what's been transmitted." "Copy. What about the field elements?" "Tell them to hold. We reassess in 10 minutes." The transmission ended. Maya lowered the receiver. Halstead was trying to contain it. That was the correct move from his position. Lock down communications, identify the source of the transmission, buy time to understand what had gone out, and to whom before the people receiving it could act on it. It was what she would have done. What he didn't know was that the 3 recipients she'd chosen weren't monitoring inboxes. They were running automated intake systems that flagged and escalated based on content classification. And the content of what she'd sent was classified at a level that triggered immediate escalation protocols. By now, 4 minutes out, at least one of those 3 destinations had already kicked the material up a level. The window between Halstead understanding what had been transmitted and someone outside his control acting on it was closing. But it wasn't closed yet, and Alpha 9 was still in the street. She pulled her personal radio. "Alpha 9, Vance? Where are you?" Static. 3 seconds. She was about to repeat when Cole's voice came back, lower than before, the register of someone talking while moving. "Northeast corridor. We hit a second blocking position at the alley junction. 2 shooters. We've suppressed but not cleared. Walsh is slowing us down." "How bad?" "He's moving. It's the terrain, not the wound. The alley's got debris. What's your position?" "South of you. I can't reach your position without crossing open ground." She was already recalculating. "The blocking position at the junction. Where are the 2 shooters exactly?" "Ground level, east side of the alley, behind what looks like a collapsed wall section, maybe waist high." She moved back toward the storage facility's south corner, the one that would give her a line of sight toward the alley junction Cole was describing. It meant reversing 20 meters of her extraction route, which she didn't love, and it meant exposure that she'd been trying to avoid, which she liked even less. She moved anyway. The corner of the building gave her a partial angle on the alley junction. Not clean, not the kind of shot she preferred, but enough to see the two shooters Cole had described. They were behind a section of collapsed masonry, exactly where he'd said, their attention oriented north toward Alpha 9's position. Neither of them was looking south. She reassembled her rifle in the dark. It took 19 seconds, which was 4 seconds longer than her best time and 3 seconds faster than anyone else she knew. Her hands were cold enough that the last connection required 2 attempts, and she registered the delay without letting it become anything other than a mechanical note to address. She found the first shooter in the scope. The angle was 17 degrees off her preferred axis, shooting around the corner of the building rather than over it, which meant she was working with a narrow vertical window and compensating for a parallax issue her scope wasn't calibrated for at this distance. She adjusted, held, fired. The first shooter went down. The second one moved, not away, toward cover, which was the trained response, and he was fast enough that by the time she cycled and reacquired, he was behind the thickest part of the masonry. She had a partial, left shoulder and the back of his head, intermittent as he shifted. She waited. A shooter behind cover who believed he was taking fire from the north would eventually expose himself to the north, trying to locate and engage the threat. She had maybe 8 seconds before he figured out the angle was wrong. 6 seconds. He moved. She fired. "Junction is clear," she said into the radio. "Move." Cole's team came through the junction 20 seconds later. She counted them from her position as they passed the gap her angle gave her, moving fast. Maddox at the rear walking backward with his rifle up. 11, 12. Walsh was on his feet, one arm across another man's shoulders, but moving under his own power in the way that people moved when the alternative was worse. 12. She held the count until she was certain. 12. "Vance," Cole's voice. "We're through. Where's the vehicle access road?" 30 meters south of the junction, left turn. There's a civilian truck, gray, parked against the east wall. Keys are above the left rear wheel. A pause. "You staged a vehicle 3 days ago." Another pause. The specific silence of someone recalibrating their assessment of a situation. "Are you coming with us?" She looked at the alley, looked at the route back to the FOB's eastern perimeter, looked at the receiver in her hand and thought about the transmission she'd sent 4 minutes ago and what it had set in motion and how much of what came next depended on her being somewhere other than the back of a truck with 12 SEALs when the first calls started coming in. "No," she said. "Get your people out. I have somewhere to be." "That's not—" He stopped. She could hear him working through it. "That's not a complete answer." "It's the answer I have right now, Lieutenant." A longer pause. "The recording you transmitted, what was on it?" "Everything." She was moving again, back down the alley, south. "Enough. The people who received it will know what to do with it." "Who received it?" "People who aren't in Halstead's chain of command." She heard him exhale. The particular quality of an exhale that carried more than air. The weight of a man who had spent the last 40 minutes fighting for his life on the basis of orders he'd been given by a man who wanted him dead, and who was now standing in a dark alley on Christmas Eve, trying to integrate that fact into a worldview that had been operating on different assumptions. "Vance." "Lieutenant." "I need to know who you are." She almost said something she would have regretted, something that would have been honest but would have complicated the next several months in ways she couldn't afford. Instead, she said, "You'll find out. Get your people to that truck and get out of the district. When you reach a clean communications environment, contact Theater Command directly. Not through Kestrel, not through Overlord directly. Tell them what happened tonight, all of it. And you? I'll be fine." She wasn't certain that was true. She clicked off the radio and kept moving. Apart. She was 6 blocks from FOB Kestrel's eastern perimeter when Sowers found her. She didn't hear him before she saw him. That was the part she'd review later, the part that she would admit to herself, in the honest accounting that she always performed after a bad situation, had been an error. She'd been monitoring the intercept equipment while moving, which divided her attention in a way that wasn't acceptable for this environment, and the signal she was tracking had pulled enough of her focus that the sound of a second person in the alley didn't register until it was closer than it should have been. She turned. Captain Reed Sowers was 12 feet away, holding a weapon that wasn't his service pistol. A civilian-patterned semi-auto, the kind of weapon you carried when you didn't want the weapon traced back to your unit armory. He looked like what he was, a man who had done something bad for long enough that it had stopped feeling bad, who had arrived at this moment through a series of individually manageable decisions that had accumulated into something he couldn't step back from. "Vance," he said. The word had the quality of a confirmation rather than a greeting. She had her rifle, still in carry configuration. Her service weapon was on her hip. Her service weapon was faster. "Sowers," she said. Neither of them moved. "The transmission," he said. Where did you route it?" "It's already been received." "That's not what I asked." "It's the relevant answer," she said. "Whatever you're thinking about doing right now, the transmission is gone. Stopping me doesn't stop what's in it." He looked at her for a long moment. She watched his eyes. Not his weapon hand, his eyes. Because the eyes moved before the hand did if you knew how to read them. His eyes were doing the math she expected them to do. A specific calculation. What could be contained, what couldn't, which variables were still in play and which had already left the board. "You've been building this for 3 weeks," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Longer," she said. 3 weeks since I had enough." "And you think it's enough?" "I know it's enough." He was quiet. His weapon was steady. She gave him that. His hand wasn't shaking, which meant he was either more experienced at this than she'd assessed, or he was running on a kind of cold focus that would eventually cost him, but wasn't going to cost him right now. "Halstead is going to say you fabricated it," Sowers said. "He's going to say you were compromised, that you had a vendetta from the disciplinary action that you manufactured. I know what he's going to say." She kept her voice flat. "I've known what he was going to say since week 2, which is why I documented the access logs, the metadata, the session timestamps, and the specific processing chain for every intelligence package going back 14 months. The fabrication argument requires explaining why the gaps in the packages are consistent with terminal access on Kestrel's secondary processing node at hours when Halstead was logged as the active user." Something moved through Sowers' expression, not quite fear. The specific look of a man who has been holding a position and has just realized the ground under it is not as solid as he thought. "You access the secondary node," he said, "among other places. Your clearances were restricted. My clearances were deprioritized. The door code hadn't been changed." She watched him. "That's going to be in the report too. The question of why the door code hadn't been changed and who was responsible for code rotation on that facility." That landed. She saw it land. Code rotation on the secondary intelligence annex was a signals officer's responsibility. Sowers' weapon hand dropped 2 inches. Not all the way, not a surrender, but enough. Enough to tell her the calculation had shifted, that the variable he'd been holding as his last piece of leverage had just been named, had been identified as already in play, was already part of what the 3 recipients of her transmission were now holding in their intake systems. "Put the weapon down, Captain," she said. He didn't, but he didn't raise it either. "It's over," she said. Not with heat, not with satisfaction, just as a statement of the tactical situation. "The operation is blown. Alpha 9 is out of the district. The command element is gone. The recording is transmitted. The documentation is in 3 places outside this theater." She took 1 step toward him. "The only question left is whether you walk out of this or whether you make a decision in the next 30 seconds that closes every other option you have." The silence between them had a texture to it, the specific density of a moment that understood its own weight. Sowers lowered the weapon. He didn't set it down. He held it at his side, pointed at the ground, which was a partial concession and a maintained option and was, she decided, enough for now. "When they come for me," he said quietly, "what do I tell them?" "Tell them the truth," she said. "All of it. Every detail. Every meeting. Every transmission. The people coming to talk to you are going to have the recordings and the access logs and the metadata. The truth is the only story that fits what they already have." She walked past him. He didn't move. She didn't look back. The perimeter gap was where she'd left it. She came through it at 0:31 on Christmas morning, walked across the open ground between the fence and the nearest permanent structure, and entered FOB Kestrel through the same door she'd left by, which was a service entrance that was supposed to require a code, but whose latch had been broken for 6 weeks, and which nobody had repaired because the work order was sitting in a maintenance queue behind 40 other items. She went directly to the secondary intelligence annex. The corporal who'd been there when she left was gone. Shift change, she registered, standard rotation. The replacement didn't know her, which was fine. She sat at the terminal she'd been using for 3 weeks, logged in with the credentials that were technically still active because nobody had gotten around to restricting them, and did one final thing. She compiled everything. Every access log, every metadata file, every documented gap, every session timestamp, into a single encrypted package and added it to the 3 transmissions she'd already sent. A 4th destination? The JAG office at theater command level, the legal office, the one that would eventually run the investigation. She wanted them to have the complete record. She wanted there to be no version of this in which the documentation was incomplete. She finished at 0:47. She sat back in the chair. Outside, somewhere in the FOB, she could hear the particular ambient noise of a military installation at 0100. Generators, distant voices, the mechanical rhythm of a place that never fully slept. Normal sounds. The sounds of a night that was ending without the 12 men who were supposed to have died in it. Her radio, still on the personal channel, gave a soft tone. Cole's voice. "Vance? We're out, all 12. She closed her eyes. "Copy," she said. "We're at a clean comms point. I'm calling theater command." "Good." A pause. "Walsh is stable. Shoulder's going to need surgery, but he's okay." "Good," she said again. Another pause. Longer. She could hear him working toward something he wasn't sure how to say. "The truck," he said finally. "You staged it 3 days ago." "Yes." "Which means you knew." "Yes." "And you came anyway, alone." She didn't answer that. It wasn't a question she needed to answer. The answer was self-evident, and they both knew it, and adding words to it would have diminished something she didn't want diminished. "Who are you?" Cole asked. The same question as before, but different now. Not tactical, not operational. Something more human than that. She thought about it for a moment. The honest answer was complicated and would take longer than either of them had right now, and would require her to account for 8 years and a series of decisions that had led her to a storage facility in Black Ridge District with a rifle and a set of intercept tools, and the willingness to throw what remained of her career into a fire in order to stop something that couldn't be allowed to continue. "A specialist," she said, "who noticed things she wasn't supposed to notice." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Get somewhere safe, Vance," he said. "Whatever happens next, get somewhere safe first." "Working on it." She clicked off the radio and looked at the terminal screen. In the top right corner, a timestamp, 0:51. Christmas morning. From somewhere deeper in the FOB, the direction of the command block, she heard a door open. Voices. More than one. The specific sound of activity at an hour when activity was not expected, the sound of people moving with purpose rather than routine. She had perhaps 10 minutes before the first wave of what she'd set in motion reached this room. She didn't move. She sat in the chair in the secondary intelligence annex with the buzzing fluorescent lights and the terminal screen and the encrypted drive in her kit bag, and she waited, because running was a version of the story she didn't want to be in. Because what she'd done tonight required her to be present for what came after it, because there was no part of this that was finished, and there was no part of it that she was going to let be finished without her standing in the middle of it, with her name on every piece of documentation and her face available for every conversation that followed. She had started this 3 weeks ago in a room very much like this one, in the same chair, looking at the same kind of absence. A gap in data where something important should have been. She had filled the gap. She had done it imperfectly. She had done it in violation of at least a dozen regulations and several direct orders, and the specific terms of an administrative restriction that she had been reminded of 3 times in the past month. She had done it in ways that were going to require careful legal accounting, and she had done it with the understanding that being right and being within the rules were not always the same thing, and that there were situations where that gap was not a technicality but a choice, and the choice had a cost, and she had made it anyway. 12 men alive. A recording transmitted to 3 independent destinations. Documentation in 4 places. And somewhere in the command block of FOB Kestrel, the first phone was ringing. She heard footsteps in the corridor. She straightened in the chair. The door to the secondary intelligence annex opened, and Major Glenn Torrance stood in the doorway looking at her with the expression of a man who had been woken up at 0100 and handed information he was going to spend the next several days regretting having received. Behind him, 2 military police officers, and behind them, visible over Torrance's shoulder, someone she hadn't expected. A face she didn't recognize, in civilian clothes, with the specific bearing of someone who had traveled a considerable distance tonight and had not done so as a formality. Torrance looked at her, then at the terminal, then at her kit bag, then back at her. Vance, he said. Major, do you want to tell me what happened tonight? She looked at him steadily. I want to tell everyone what happened tonight, she said. That's rather the point. Torrance's jaw worked. He looked like a man who had wanted this to be simpler than it was going to be, which was a feeling she understood, which was also a feeling she had no particular obligation to accommodate. The civilian behind him stepped forward. Specialist Vance, the man said. His voice had the particular quality of someone who asked questions for a living and had learned to make the questions sound like statements. My name is Aldrich. I work for an office you'll be briefed on shortly. He looked at her with the attention of someone who had read a file and was now comparing it to the original. I understand you've had a busy evening. She met his eyes. I have documentation, she said. 14 months of it. You'll want all of it. Aldrich looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said quietly. We will. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Outside, the FOB continued its nocturnal rhythm, indifferent and constant, the sound of an institution that had not yet registered the thing that had just happened inside it, the thing that would take months to fully surface, that would move through the system the way a fracture moved through material under stress, invisible at first and then suddenly, completely, everywhere, at once. Colonel Victor Halstead, at that moment, was in the command block 40 meters away. She didn't know exactly what he was doing. She imagined he was making calls. She imagined he was working very hard with the same smooth authority that had characterized everything she'd seen him do to get ahead of something he didn't yet fully understand had already gotten ahead of him. She thought about the 14-minute gap, the 11-minute gap, the 9-minute gap. She thought about 8 operations and the soldiers they'd consumed and the reports that had been written afterward attributing the failures to bad luck and degraded analysis. She thought about Daniel Park's 4 words on an encrypted channel 2 years ago. Then she stopped thinking about all of it, because the man named Aldrich was pulling a chair from the corner of the room and sitting across from her, and the conversation that was about to begin was the one that everything else had been preparation for, and she wanted to be completely present for it. Start from the beginning, Aldrich said. She did. Aldrich asked good questions. That was the first thing Maya noticed about him. Not his credentials, which he'd presented briefly and which she'd filed away for later verification. Not his manner, which was professional without being warm. Not the specific agency designation on the identification he'd shown her, which she recognized and which told her something useful about the seriousness with which at least one of her 3 transmission recipients had treated what she'd sent. What she noticed was that he asked good questions, specific ones. Questions that indicated he had read something before coming here, not the file her chain of command had built on her, the disciplinary record, and the administrative hold documentation in Torrance's memos, but something else. Something that suggested he'd had access to material she hadn't known was being compiled. They talked for 2 hours in the secondary intelligence annex, while Torrance waited outside with the visible discomfort of a man who had been excluded from a room he technically outranked everyone in. The military police officers had been thanked and redirected. The door was closed. Aldrich worked chronologically, which she appreciated. He started 14 months back, at the first operation she'd flagged, and he moved forward through each one with the methodical patience of someone building a structure rather than fishing for a specific answer. He let her present the documentation in her own sequence. He didn't interrupt to redirect her toward what he already knew. He asked clarifying questions at the right moments and stayed quiet at the moments when staying quiet was more useful. When she finished, when she reached the secondary intelligence annex, the transmission, the alley, Sowers, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "How long did you know it was Halstead specifically, rather than a compromise somewhere in the processing chain?" "Conclusively. 3 weeks ago, the second signal's intercept. And the first intercept. Strong suspicion, not proof." "What would you have done if the Christmas Eve operation hadn't been in the pipeline? If there'd been no specific team, no specific date?" She thought about it honestly, kept building the case, tried to get the documentation to someone outside the theater command structure through a channel that couldn't be interdicted. She paused. It would have taken longer. There would have been more operations in the interim. Aldrich looked at her steadily. More operations means more casualties. Yes. And you couldn't find a faster path. I couldn't find a path that didn't go through someone in Halstead's network. She met his eyes. I tried. The JAG office at theater level has an intake protocol that routes through the theater commander's staff for preliminary assessment. The IG channel requires a formal complaint through the chain of command. The oversight mechanisms that are supposed to be independent aren't at the operational level. They're downstream of the same command authority. Aldrich made a note. Not on a device, on a small paper notebook, the kind that was anachronistic enough to be deliberate. That's going to be in the report, he said quietly. Not to her, to himself, or to the notebook, or to the institutional structure he was apparently also examining. Good, she said. He looked up. It should be, she said, because it's the part that made everything else possible. Halstead didn't operate in a vacuum. He operated in a system that was structured in a way that made what he was doing very difficult to surface through normal channels. That's not an accident. That's worth understanding. Aldrich looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating something. You've thought about this a great deal, he said. I've had 3 weeks of administrative hold and very little else to do. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, the functional equivalent of one. All right, he said. He closed the notebook. I need to ask you something that isn't part of the formal record yet. Okay? Tonight, in the district, you acted alone, without authorization, in direct violation of your restriction order, and you engaged enemy combatants without orders. He said it without judgment, laying the facts out the way you laid out terrain on a map, not to make an argument, just to establish the geography. How many? She knew what he was asking. The count. 17, she said. 11 confirmed direct, 6 corroborated by the disruption of their positions. He was quiet. The rooftop sniper had a firing solution on Lieutenant Cole, she said. I had approximately 25 seconds. I know, Aldrich said. I'm not questioning the decision. I'm asking you to be specific about it because the people who are going to question it later will ask, and I want the record to be yours before it's anyone else's. She understood that. She gave him the full account. Each element of the sequence, the order, the rationale, the distance and conditions for each shot. She gave it the way she'd been trained to give an after-action report. Precise, chronological, without editorial framing. When she finished, Aldrich stood up. I need to make some calls, he said. Stay in this room. Am I under arrest? Not at this moment. He paused at the door. That may change depending on how the next 2 hours go. I want you to understand that. I understand it. He left. She sat alone in the secondary intelligence annex for 40 minutes. She wasn't idle. She used the terminal to compile one final documentation set, a clean version of everything organized for legal review, with each piece of evidence labeled and sourced and connected to the larger pattern by a written summary that she drafted carefully, because she understood that the difference between evidence and noise was often the quality of the explanation connecting them. She'd spent 8 years watching good intelligence get buried under bad analysis, and she wasn't going to let that happen to the best documentation she'd ever built. She was on the second page of the summary when the door opened, and it wasn't Aldrich. It was Torrance. He came in without knocking, which told her something about the state he was in, because Torrance was a man who knocked. He stood in the center of the small room, looking at her with the expression she'd been expecting since she'd walked back through the perimeter gap. A compound expression, layered, the official severity on top, and underneath it something else, something less composed. "You want to explain to me," he said, "what you thought you were doing." She looked at him. "Which part?" "Any part. All of it." He pulled the second chair, the one Aldrich had used, and sat down. The severity shifted slightly when he sat, became something more human and less official. "Vance, you walked off this installation. You operated in a combat zone under restriction. You engaged enemy combatants without orders. You ran an unauthorized transmission from an intercept operation you were conducting on equipment you shouldn't have had." He stopped. "Do you understand how much trouble you're in?" "Yes," she said. "Do you understand that Halstead is already—" He stopped himself, looked at the door, looked back at her. "He's already building a response. He's saying the recording is fabricated. He's saying you had a vendetta. He's saying that your actions in the district tonight were the actions of a soldier who had gone outside the wire unauthorized and engaged civilian combatants without—" "The recording isn't fabricated," she said. "The access logs aren't fabricated. The metadata isn't fabricated. The 14 months of documented intelligence gaps aren't fabricated." She kept her voice even. "I know what he's going to say, Major. I've known since week 2. I built the documentation specifically to address the fabrication argument." Torrance looked at her for a long moment. "Who is Aldrich?" he asked. "Someone whose office operates outside the theater command structure," she said, "which is why I routed one of my transmissions to them." Torrance absorbed that. She watched him process it, the specific sequence of a man who was understanding, incrementally, that the situation he'd walked into tonight was considerably larger and more structurally complicated than a soldier going outside the wire. "The other 2 transmissions," he said carefully. "One to an oversight mechanism I identified as genuinely independent, one to the JAG office at theater level with a full documentation package." Torrance was quiet. "Glenn," she said, and using his first name was a deliberate choice, not intimacy, but a shift in register that signaled she was about to say something outside the official framework. "I tried to do this the right way for 3 weeks. I looked for every legitimate channel. I documented every reason the legitimate channels weren't accessible." "That documentation is in the package." She paused. "I didn't want to go to Blackridge. I wanted to walk into your office with a folder and hand it to you and have you take it seriously." Torrance said nothing. "But I did the math on that," she said, "and the math didn't work." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the fluorescent light's buzz became noticeable again. 12 men, he said finally. Not a question. 12 men. He stood up. He looked at the door again. He looked at the terminal screen where her documentation summary was still open. He looked like a man doing the same calculation she'd done 3 weeks ago and arriving at the same place she'd arrived. "I'm going to need a copy of everything," he said. "It's already compiled. I'll transfer it when Aldrich clears the terminal use." He nodded. At the door he stopped. "The Marine operation," he said. 3 months ago, the 4 men." "Yes." "I told Delaney you overreacted." She said nothing. "I was working from the sanitized package," he said. "I didn't pull the raw feed." "I know," she said. He left without saying anything else, which was the right call. There wasn't anything else to say that would have added to it, and Torrance, for all his institutional caution, understood when addition was not the right operation. But Aldrich came back at 3:20. He came in with a different energy than he'd left with. Still composed, still professional, but with the specific quality of someone who had made calls and had received, in return, information that had confirmed or exceeded what they were expecting. "Halstead is in custody," he said. He sat down. "As of 40 minutes ago." Maya kept her face still. "Sowers turned himself in at 2:15, Aldrich continued. "He's cooperating. His cooperation is what accelerated the timeline on Halstead." He looked at her. "Did you know he'd cooperate?" "I assessed it as probable," she said. "He's not a true believer. He got into it for reasons that made sense to him at the time, and spent the last year understanding they didn't. The encounter in the alley, when I told him the transmissions were already gone, I watched him run the calculation. The only play that gives him any outcome other than the worst one is cooperation. You engineered that. I presented the tactical situation accurately, she said. What he did with it was his decision. Aldrich looked at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of being impressed, which was a restrained and slightly skeptical version that she found more credible than the alternative. The investigation is going to be extensive, he said. 14 months of operations, multiple casualties, the intelligence processing chain, the command structure. He leaned forward slightly. You're going to be central to it. Your testimony, your documentation, your account of tonight. This is going to take months. I know. Your status during that period is going to be complicated. He chose the word carefully. You've committed several violations that are real and documentable, and that the people managing this investigation are going to have to account for. The fact that those violations were in service of preventing something significantly worse doesn't erase them. I know that too. What I can tell you, Aldrich said, is that the transmission you sent at 23:51 tonight reached my office's automated intake at 23:54 and was escalated to my director at 0003. My director called me at 0009. I was on a helicopter at 0031. He paused. That's the fastest response time our office has had to a field intake in 4 years. She let that sit for a moment. The recording is authentic, she said. The documentation supports it completely. We know, Aldrich said. We knew by 1 o'clock. The authentication protocols take 11 minutes when the material is clean. He stood up. I'm going to be honest with you about what happens next, because you've earned the honesty and because I think you'll handle it better than most. All right? There will be charges. Not from my office. My office doesn't charge. We investigate and refer. But the military justice process is going to have to address what you did tonight, and the people running that process are going to be operating under pressure from several directions simultaneously. Some of those directions are going to push for leniency given the context. Some are going to push for prosecution regardless, because the institutional precedent of a soldier under restriction going outside the wire and engaging enemy combatants without orders is one the system is uncomfortable leaving unaddressed. He looked at her directly. It is going to be a difficult several months. Yes, she said, and at the end of it, your career may look very different from what it looked like 2 years ago. My career looked very different from what it looked like 2 years ago before tonight, she said. Halstead made sure of that when I filed the first report. Aldrich was quiet. I'm not asking for an outcome, she said. I'm asking for the process to have access to everything I built. Whatever the process decides after that, that's the process. He nodded once. He picked up his notebook. He moved toward the door. One more thing, she said. He stopped. Alpha 9, she said. Lieutenant Cole and his team, they need to be debriefed by someone outside the Kestrel command structure. What they heard tonight, the radio traffic, the extraction denial, the specific language Halstead used, that's testimonial evidence. It needs to be preserved correctly. Already in motion, Aldrich said. Cole contacted Theater Command at 1:47. The debrief team is being assembled separately from anything connected to Kestrel. He paused. He asked about you. She said nothing. He asked whether you were in custody, Aldrich said. He asked that before he asked about the investigation, before he asked about Halstead. He looked at her for a moment. I thought you'd want to know that. He left. She sat alone again. Through the wall, distant, she could hear the sounds of the FOB moving through its early morning routine, the generators, the vehicle traffic, the institutional hum of a place that ran on schedule, regardless of what had happened inside it. It was 3:31 on Christmas morning. In other places, across the world, people were doing the things people did on this particular morning. She didn't think about that often, the distance between where she was and where other versions of her life might have landed. It wasn't productive. But at 3:31, in the secondary intelligence annex of FOB Kestrel, with a buzzing fluorescent light and a terminal screen and the particular silence that follows action, she thought about it briefly. Then she went back to the documentation summary. She had 3 more pages to write. They came for Halstead at 4 o'clock. She knew because she heard it. Not the specific sounds of an arrest, The FOB's construction insulated sound too well for that. But the change in the ambient noise outside, the increase in vehicle traffic toward the command block, the specific pattern of movement that an installation made when something official and significant was happening in its administrative center. She heard it, and she kept writing. At 4:47, the door opened, and a woman she hadn't seen before came in. Uniformed, JAG insignia, the particular bearing of someone who had driven a long way and was running on professional focus rather than rest. "Specialist Vance," the woman said. "I'm Major Cassandra Webb, Judge Advocate General's Office, theater level. I've been assigned to your case." Maya looked at her. "My case meaning the formal investigation into your conduct tonight and the concurrent investigation into Operation Longbow and associated activities under Colonel Halstead's command." Webb sat down in the chair across from her. She had a tablet and a physical folder and the expression of someone who had read everything and was still forming an opinion. "I want to be direct with you. Please. You're facing serious charges: violation of restriction order, unauthorized operation in a combat zone, engagement of hostile forces without orders, unauthorized access to classified systems beyond your current clearance status." Webb laid it out cleanly, without drama. "These are not small things." "I know." "At the same time," Webb said, "the context is—" The investigation team is describing the context as significant. She paused. "That's unusual language for this office." "What does it mean practically?" "It means the charges will be filed because they have to be. It means the process will proceed because it has to. And it means the outcome of that process is going to depend heavily on testimony, documentation, and the findings of the Longbow investigation." Webb looked at her steadily. "Do you have legal representation?" "Not yet." "You need to get some before the formal charge process begins." Webb placed a card on the table. "This is someone I'm not allowed to recommend because of my position, but I am allowed to tell you that she has the relevant experience and that she operates completely independently of any command structure connected to this theater." Maya looked at the card, picked it up. "One question," she said. "Go ahead." "Halstead's argument is going to be fabrication, that I manufactured the recordings, that the documentation was constructed to support a predetermined conclusion." She met Webb's eyes. "Is the authentication sufficient to close that argument?" Webb was quiet for a moment. "The authentication on the recordings is clean," she said. "The metadata forensics on the intelligence gaps have been reviewed by 2 independent analysts in the past 2 hours, and both have confirmed the processing chain alterations." She paused. "And Sowers is providing a detailed account that independently corroborates the material you submitted." "So yes." Webb looked at her with the careful expression of a lawyer who never said yes when the evidence said yes for them. "The fabrication argument," Webb said, "is going to have a very difficult time in front of the available evidence." That was enough. At 6:15 on Christmas morning, they moved Maya to a separate facility on the FOB. Not a cell, a restricted quarters room with a guard on the door, and her kit bag allowed inside and her personal radio and intercept equipment held for evidentiary processing. The room had a cot, a small desk, and a window that looked out over the vehicle pool. She sat on the cot and looked at the window. At 7:40, the door opened, and it wasn't Aldrich or Webb or Torrance. It was Ryan Maddox. He was in clean clothes, post-debrief, the slight hollowness around his eyes that came from an operation and no sleep, and the particular experience of having survived something that had been designed to prevent your survival. He stood in the doorway and looked at her with the expression of a man who had a great many things to say and was working out which one went first. "They said 5 minutes," he said. "Okay." He came in. He didn't sit. He stood with his arms at his sides and looked at her the way soldiers looked at people they were trying to understand, the full direct attention that didn't allow for social performance. "The voice on the radio," he said. "In the northeast corridor, that was you." "Yes." "And the 2 shooters at the junction?" "Yes." "And before that, the rooftop, the RPG?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Cole said you wouldn't come with us," he said. "I had something to finish. He's been asking about you since 2 o'clock. Maddox's jaw moved slightly. All 12 of us have been asking about you since 2 o'clock. They won't tell us much. I know. She paused. I'm in a complicated position legally. It's going to take some time to sort out. They're going to charge you, Maddox said. It wasn't a question. Probably. For saving our lives. For violating my restriction order and operating without authorization and engaging without orders. She met his eyes. The reason I did those things is context. The charges are the charges. Maddox looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that was complex and difficult to name. Not anger exactly, not at her, but the specific frustration of a man confronting a system that was going to do an infuriating thing and that he couldn't stop by wanting it not to. Walsh is in surgery, he said. I heard. Shoulder. He's going to be fine. Surgeon said clean in and out, nothing structural. He paused. Cole's writing his statement now. All of us are. We've been told to be specific and complete and to include everything about the radio traffic from Halstead. He looked at her. We're going to be specific and complete. Good. Is there anything you need? Anything we can, legally, I mean, anything that helps? Your testimony helps, she said. What you heard on the command channel, the extraction denial, the specific language, that's important. You'll have it. He moved toward the door, stopped, turned back. I've been in this for 11 years, he said. I've seen a lot of people do difficult things in difficult situations. I've seen people do the right thing and get punished for it. He looked at her steadily. I've never seen somebody do what you did last night. She didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. Merry Christmas, Vance, he said. He left. She looked at the window. The vehicle pool was coming to life in the early morning light, trucks moving, personnel crossing between buildings, the ordinary machinery of a military installation running its ordinary routines, indifferent to the extraordinary thing that had run through it in the night. Her kit bag sat at the foot of the cot. Inside it, the encrypted drive with 3 weeks of work on it. Not the copy she'd transmitted, that was gone into the system now, irreversible, in the hands of people who would process it through mechanisms she couldn't influence or accelerate. But the original. The first files. The spreadsheet she'd built in the secondary intelligence annex at a terminal she wasn't supposed to be using, at hours when she was supposed to be in her quarters, in the particular silence of a room whose fluorescent light buzzed at a frequency just below conscious awareness. She reached into the bag and took out the drive. She held it for a moment. 14 months of dead soldiers and missing data, and the careful, patient work of a man who had constructed himself a position he believed was unassailable because the mechanisms that were supposed to threaten it were the same mechanisms he controlled. He had been wrong about that by exactly the distance between his assumptions about who she was and who she actually was. She set the drive on the desk. Outside, somewhere on the FOB, a door opened. Voices. The ordinary sounds of a place continuing its ordinary functions. And in a room 40 meters away that she would never see the inside of, Colonel Victor Halstead was understanding, for the first time and completely, that the woman he had spent 2 months trying to make irrelevant had been, the entire time, the most relevant person in his world. The drive sat on the desk for 3 days before anyone came to collect it. That was how Maya marked time in the restricted quarters room. Not by the light through the window, which was gray and consistent, and told her very little about what was happening outside it, but by the small procedural events that arrived at irregular intervals. Aldrich on the first morning, asking 3 follow-up questions he'd thought of overnight. Webb on the afternoon of the second day, with paperwork that Maya signed in 4 places and initialed in 2. A JAG paralegal on the third morning who collected the encrypted drive with the careful handling of someone who understood what it represented and didn't want to be the person who dropped it. She ate the meals that came. She slept in the intervals when sleep was available. She did not have her phone, her radio, or her intercept equipment, all of which were in evidentiary processing, and the absence of signals to monitor created a quiet that was strange after 3 weeks of constant collection. She sat with the quiet and did not try to fill it. On the 4th day, Webb came back. She came in the mid-morning with a different energy than her previous visits, still composed, still professional, but with the specific quality of someone carrying information they had been waiting to deliver. She sat in the chair across from the cot, set her tablet on the desk without opening it, and looked at Maya directly. "The formal charges have been filed," she said. Maya waited. "Violation of restriction order. Unauthorized operation in a combat zone. Engagement of hostile combatants without orders." Webb paused. "The unauthorized systems access charge has been withdrawn." "Why?" "Because the systems you accessed were ones you had legitimate clearance for prior to the administrative action, and the administrative action didn't formally suspend those clearances. It deprioritized them, which is a procedural distinction that doesn't constitute a formal access restriction under the relevant regulation." Webb's expression was carefully neutral. "Someone in the processing chain made an error when they wrote your restriction terms." "Sowers," Maya said. Webb looked at her. "Sowers managed the access protocols for the secondary annex," Maya said. "He wrote the restriction terms." Webb was quiet for a moment. "That's going to be in the investigation report." "I know." She paused. "The other 3 charges?" "Will proceed," Webb said. "The hearing is scheduled for 6 weeks out. Theater level, 3-member board." She picked up the tablet, opened it, turned it to face Maya. "This is the witness list the prosecution has submitted." Maya read it. Halstead's name was not on it, which made sense. Halstead was facing his own proceedings, and his testimony and hers would be a legal complication nobody needed. Torrance was on it. Delaney was on it. 2 officers she didn't recognize whose names and ranks suggested they were from the theater command staff. "And the defense witness list," Webb said, taking the tablet back and navigating. She turned it around again. Maya read it. 12 names, Alpha 9, all of them. Cole at the top, Maddox second, the remaining 10 in order of rank. Below them, 4 names she recognized from the Marine operation 3 months ago: Torres, Hendricks, and 2 others. Below them, Aldrich's name with his office designation. She looked at the list for a moment. "Cole submitted the request," Webb said. "All 12 of them. He filed it 2 days ago, formally and in writing, with a cover letter that I'm not supposed to characterize, but that I will tell you was direct." "What did it say?" Webb looked at her with the careful expression of a lawyer maintaining professional distance from something that had affected her more than she was going to admit. "It said that the 12 members of Alpha 9 had direct and specific testimony relevant to the charges against Specialist Vance, and that their testimony bore directly on the question of whether the orders she violated were legitimate orders deserving of compliance, and that any proceeding that did not include their full testimony would be, his word, incomplete." Maya said nothing. "He also said," Webb continued, "and again I'm not supposed to characterize, he said that the military justice system had an opportunity to determine whether following an order to stand still while 12 men were killed constituted the kind of obedience the system was designed to protect." The room was quiet. "That's going to make things interesting," Maya said. "It's already made things interesting," Webb said. "The board composition has been revised twice in the past 48 hours." The 6 weeks moved at institutional speed, which was its own kind of discipline. Maya spent them in the restricted quarters room, in the secondary intelligence annex under supervision, and in 2 additional sessions with Aldrich that were longer and more detailed than the first, and that ranged across the full 14 months with the thoroughness of people who were building something intended to survive legal scrutiny at the highest level. The Longbow investigation expanded as it moved. That was the word Aldrich used. Expanded. And he used it in the way that people used words when the word was doing work they didn't want to overstate. The investigation found what Maya had found, and then it found more. The intelligence gaps she documented were confirmed and traced back through the processing chain to specific terminal sessions, and the terminal sessions were connected to specific individuals, and the individuals were connected to a financial architecture that explained what Halstead had been selling, and to whom, and for how long. Longbow was not the name of a single operation. It was the name of a commercial arrangement, a word Maya would have found almost comically inadequate for what it described if the description hadn't included the names of American soldiers who had died inside it. Halstead had been running a selective intelligence service for foreign interests for 26 months. Not selling everything. That would have been detectable. Selling specific things at specific times to specific buyers whose needs he understood well enough to anticipate. And when field elements were assigned to operations that might generate evidence of what he was doing, or when soldiers reported anomalies that pointed toward the gaps he'd created, the gaps in their intelligence packages became a different kind of gap, the kind that kept them from coming back. Sowers had handled the technical execution. His cooperation was complete and detailed and corroborated every major element of what Maya had built. His motives had been financial, and then had become self-preservation, and then had become, in the final months, a kind of trapped momentum. The specific situation of someone who has gone far enough into a wrong thing that stopping feels more dangerous than continuing. He was not a sympathetic figure. He was also, in the accounting that investigations had to do, a useful one. Captain Delaney, whose sanitized intelligence package had sent 4 Marines into an alley without the data that would have warned them about the flanking element, Delaney hadn't known. That was the investigation's finding, and Maya believed it because she had watched Torrance operate for 9 months and understood the particular dynamic of people who worked downstream of Halstead's edits without knowing they were working downstream of Halstead's edits. The system had been constructed to make its own manipulation invisible. That was what made it effective, and what made it ultimately the kind of thing that could only be surfaced from the inside, from someone who noticed gaps. The hearing convened on a Tuesday morning in late February. The room was a formal military proceeding space at theater headquarters, not FOB Kestrel, which was currently the subject of 2 separate administrative reviews, but a building 400 kilometers away that had the specific institutional gravity of a place where decisions with consequences were made. 3 board members at a long table, a prosecution team of 2. Webb at the defense table, with Maya beside her in a uniform that felt strange after 2 months of restricted quarters clothing. The prosecution took the morning. They were professional and they were thorough, and they presented the charges in the sequence that made their strongest argument: restriction violation first, then unauthorized operation, then engagement without orders. And they built the case the way the case needed to be built, which was on the facts as they stood. Maya had violated her restriction. She had operated in a combat zone without authorization. She had engaged enemy combatants without orders. These things were not in dispute. The prosecution's argument did not require them to be in dispute. It required only that the board find the violations material and that the context, the reasons, did not constitute a legal defense. It was a competent argument. Maya watched the board members during it, 2 colonels and a brigadier general, the general in the center. The general's face was the kind of face that experienced officers developed over decades. Not blank, but controlled. The expression that revealed nothing while taking in everything. She watched him listen to the prosecution, and she could not read him, which she accepted as the appropriate condition. The afternoon was the defense. Webb opened with the Longbow investigation findings, a summary that Aldrich had cleared for introduction as supporting context. She walked the board through the 14 months, the intelligence gaps, the processing chain alterations, the financial architecture, the body count. She was efficient, and she did not editorialize. She let the material carry its own weight, which was considerable. Then she called Cole. He came to the stand in his dress uniform, and he sat with the particular posture of someone who had decided before entering the room that he was going to say exactly what he meant, and that the formal surroundings were not going to change that. He was not nervous. Maya had not expected him to be nervous. The prosecution's cross was brief because there was nothing in Cole's account they could effectively challenge. He had been there. He had heard Halstead's voice on the command channel. He had received the extraction denial, and his testimony on those points was clean and specific and supported by 11 other witnesses who would say the same thing. Webb's direct examination was longer. "Lieutenant Cole," Webb said, "when Specialist Vance made radio contact with your team in the Northeast Corridor, what did she tell you?" "She told me the command structure that sent us in was compromised. She told us the exfil through Overlord wasn't coming. She gave us a route and a vehicle location." "Did you follow her instructions?" "Yes." "Why?" Cole looked at the board. "Because the sniper who had been tracking me for the previous 30 seconds was no longer tracking me. Because the RPG position that would have ended our night was empty. Because the information she was giving us was accurate and actionable, and the information we'd been receiving through official channels had gotten us surrounded in a kill zone on Christmas Eve. He paused. I followed her instructions because she'd already proven she knew more about what was happening than anyone I had authorization to listen to. And the extraction denial from Colonel Halstead. I received it at 2347, direct on the command channel. Exact words. Extraction denied. Hold position. What did you understand that order to mean? Cole was quiet for a moment. I understood it to mean we weren't getting out, he said. Not that night. Not through any channel Halstead controlled. Webb thanked him and sat down. The prosecution declined to recross. Bob. Maddox came after Cole. He was more compressed than Cole. Fewer words, the same information, delivered with the blunt economy of someone who had decided that brevity was its own argument. He confirmed the radio traffic. He confirmed the staged vehicles, which he had identified independently. He confirmed the coordinated nature of the enemy tactical positions. He confirmed Walsh's wound and the timeline of the team's extraction. At the end of Webb's examination, Maddox said something that hadn't been in any of the prepared questions. Permission to add something for the record, he said. The board's presiding officer, the Brigadier General, looked at him for a moment. Go ahead. I've been doing this for 11 years, Maddox said. I've operated with a lot of people. I want the board to understand something about what happened in that district. He stopped. He looked at the general directly. We were gone. The geometry of that operation was designed by people who understood how we move. Every exit was covered. The comms were locked. The only variable they didn't account for was one woman on a rooftop who shouldn't have been there. He paused. I don't know what the board decides about the charges. I know that without her we don't come home, all 12 of us. And I know that the order that put us in that position came from inside this institution. Another pause. I think that's relevant context. The general's expression didn't change, but he wrote something in the notebook in front of him. A quote. The board recessed at 1700 and came back at 900 the following morning. Maya had spent the night in quarters assigned to her at theater headquarters. Not restricted, not guarded. The first unguarded sleep she'd had in 2 months. She'd lain on the cot for 4 hours before sleeping arrived, running through the day's testimony the way she always ran through after-action material, cataloging what had landed and what hadn't, and what remained uncertain. What remained uncertain was everything that was supposed to remain uncertain. The board would decide what the board decided. She had done what she could do, and what she could do had included building 14 months of documentation that had triggered an investigation that had reached, as of the previous week, 11 separate individuals connected to the Longbow network, and had generated a legal case against Halstead that the Theater JAG's office described in terms she'd heard secondhand through Webb as straightforward, which was the most positive characterization that office used about anything. She thought about Daniel Park's 4 words. Watch your back, Vance. She thought about the Marine operation, the 3 calls she'd made to Delaney, the sound of Delaney telling her the intelligence was unconfirmed while the flanking element was 4 minutes from the extract route. She thought about the 14-minute gap, the specific cleanness of it, the work that went into making an absence look like nothing. She slept for 3 hours and woke before her alarm and sat at the edge of the cot in the gray pre-dawn light and let herself exist in the uncertainty without trying to resolve it, because she had learned over the years that some intervals were meant to be inhabited rather than managed. The board reconvened at 9 o'clock. The general read the findings himself, which Webb had told her was not universal practice. Sometimes the senior member delegated it, and which Maya read as a signal about the weight he was giving the proceeding, though she kept that reading loose. On the charge of violation of restriction order, the general said, the board finds the violation established as a matter of fact. The board further finds that the restriction order was issued pursuant to an administrative process that was itself operating within a command environment compromised by the subject of the Longbow investigation. The board is not empowered to dismiss the charge on that basis. The charge stands. Maya kept her face still. On the charge of unauthorized operation in a combat zone, the general continued, the board finds the violation established as a matter of fact. The charge stands. Webb's hand was very still on the table beside her. "On the charge of engagement of hostile combatants without orders," the general said. He paused. A brief pause. The pause of someone choosing language carefully. "The board finds the violation established as a matter of fact. The charge stands." The room was very quiet. "On the matter of disposition," the general said. He looked up from the paper. He looked at Maya directly, which was a thing she hadn't expected and which she received without looking away. "The board has considered the full context of the violations, including the findings of the Longbow investigation, the testimony of 12 members of Alpha 9, and the specific circumstances that preceded and surrounded Specialist Vance's actions on the night of December 24th. He paused. "The board has also considered that those actions resulted in the survival of 12 American service members who would not otherwise have survived the night." He set the paper down. "The board's disposition on all 3 charges is as follows. All charges are formally entered into the record. Specialist Vance will receive an official reprimand, which will be entered into her service record. No punitive action beyond the reprimand, no reduction in grade, no confinement." He picked the paper up again. "Additionally, the board is forwarding a formal recommendation to the relevant authority that Specialist Vance's prior commendation, withdrawn following the administrative action initiated by Colonel Halstead, be reinstated and entered into her permanent record." He set the paper down again. "This proceeding is closed." The room began to move, the sound of people shifting, collecting papers, the ambient noise of an official proceeding returning to its component parts. Webb put her pen down on the table. "That's the best outcome available under the charges as filed," she said quietly. "The reprimand is real. It's in your record." "I know," Maya said, "and the reinstatement recommendation isn't guaranteed. It goes to a separate authority." "I know." Webb looked at her. "You're not happy." Maya stopped, looked at the table, looked at the room emptying around her. "I'm fine with it. The reprimand is accurate. I violated the orders. The context is what it is, but I violated them." She paused. "I'm fine with it." Webb studied her for a moment. "The reinstatement will go through," she said. "The authority reviewing it has read the Longbow report." Maya nodded. "And Halstead," she said. Webb's expression settled into something harder and more satisfied than her professional manner usually allowed. "His hearing is in 6 weeks. The charges include treason, murder conspiracy, and 11 counts related to the Longbow network. Sowers has provided full cooperation. The financial records have been fully traced." She paused. "He's going to spend the rest of his life in a military prison." The room was nearly empty now. "He told the investigators you were unstable," Webb said, "that you'd constructed an elaborate false narrative to justify insubordination, that the recordings were manipulated." She tilted her head slightly. "He said it very convincingly." "He would," Maya said. "The authentication stood up," Webb said. "He knows it stood up. He's known since the 2nd week." She stood, collected her things. "I think the convincing presentation is the only gear he has left. Everything else is gone." She found Cole outside the building. He was standing on the steps in the thin February light, his cover in his hand, looking out at the flat institutional landscape of theater headquarters, with the expression of someone who had fulfilled an obligation and was now deciding what the rest of the day looked like. He turned when he heard the door. They looked at each other for a moment. "Reprimand," he said. "Reprimand." "That's it. That's it." He looked at her for a moment longer. He put his cover on. He came down 2 steps so they were closer to the same level, which was a small thing and deliberate. "I've been trying to figure out what to say to you since Christmas morning," he said. "You don't have to say anything." "I know I don't." He looked at her steadily. "I want to." He stopped, worked at it. "You came to Black Ridge District alone. You'd been watching the enemy position since the afternoon. You staged a vehicle 3 days in advance. You built a 14-month evidentiary case while under administrative sanction. And you did all of it without telling anyone, without asking for help, without—" He stopped again. "Why didn't you ask for help?" She thought about it. "There wasn't anyone to ask," she said. "The channels were compromised. The people I might have asked were downstream of the same command authority I was trying to document. You could have come to us, Cole said. To Alpha 9, before the mission. I didn't know it was Alpha 9 until 3 days out, she said. And coming to you 3 days out, without full documentation, with an accusation against a colonel, that puts you in an impossible position. You can't act on it. You can't report it up the chain without it going through Kestrel. You're just 12 men who've been told their colonel might be dirty, with no way to verify it and no time to try. He was quiet. The vehicle was the only thing I could give you without blowing the documentation, she said. The vehicle and the position and 90 seconds. Cole looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. The specific nod of a man who has run the logic and found it sound, even if the logic led somewhere he wished it hadn't. Where are you going? He asked. After this. She hadn't fully answered that question yet. The answer existed in parts. Her active sniper designation had been formally suspended during the proceedings and would require a reinstatement process separate from the commendation recommendation. Her position at FOB Kestrel was administratively vacant. Kestrel itself was under review, its command structure being rebuilt from 2 levels below where Halstead had stood. The specific unit she'd been assigned to no longer existed in its previous form. I don't know yet, she said. There's a process. The process takes time. Everything takes time. He reached into his jacket and took out a card. Not a military-issue contact card, a plain one, handwritten. He held it out. My personal line, he said, and Maddox's, and the other 10. He paused. If it takes longer than it should, or if it goes sideways in ways it shouldn't, I want you to call. She took the card, looked at it, 12 names and 12 numbers in Cole's handwriting, close together on a small white card. You did this yourself, she said. Maddox wrote the ones on the back. His handwriting is better. She turned the card over, 6 names in a cleaner hand. She put the card in her pocket. Thank you, she said. Not for the card specifically. For the testimony, the witness list, the cover letter Webb hadn't been able to characterize. All of it. For 12 men who had come to a hearing 400 kilometers from FOB Kestrel on a Tuesday in February because a woman on a rooftop had made a decision on Christmas Eve, and they had decided collectively that the decision deserved to be stood beside. Cole looked at her. Don't thank me, he said. You were the one on the roof. He shook her hand, was firm, brief, the handshake of someone who had more to say and had decided the handshake said it better, and walked down the steps toward the vehicle pool. She watched him go. The commendation reinstatement came through in March. It arrived as a formal document delivered by Webb, who brought it to the temporary quarters Maya had been assigned at a base 300 kilometers from Kestrel while her status was being processed. Webb handed it over with the professional satisfaction of someone who had told a client it would happen and was now watching it happen. Maya read it, set it on the desk, looked at it for a moment. Halstead's pretrial hearing started this week, Webb said. You'll be called as a witness. The prosecution team will be in contact. I know. The Longbow investigation has reached 14 individuals as of this morning. 3 are in pretrial. The rest are in various stages of the investigation process. Webb paused. There's also a systemic review underway. The intelligence processing chain, the access protocols, the oversight mechanisms at the theater command level. It was initiated by the theater commander's office based on Aldrich's investigation findings. The channels, Maya said. The channels, Webb confirmed. The specific structural gaps that allowed this to operate for as long as it did. They're being documented and addressed. Maya looked at the commendation on the desk. A piece of paper that had existed once, been withdrawn, and now existed again. A small arc that contained within it a great deal of the past 2 years. My reinstatement as an active sniper, she said. Where does that stand? The review board convenes next month. Given the commendation reinstatement and the hearing disposition, the expectation is favorable. Webb paused. There will be a new unit assignment. Kestrel is being restructured substantially. I know. You won't be going back there. I know that too. Webb picked up her bag. At the door, she stopped. For what it's worth, she said, and the professional distance in her voice had thinned slightly, enough to let something more direct through. The systemic review, the one looking at the oversight mechanisms, it's using your documentation as a primary reference. The specific analysis of how Halstead was able to maintain the processing chain alterations without detection for 14 months. The structural gaps. She looked at Maya. It's going to change how the channels work. For future. She stopped. For the next person who notices something. Maya was quiet for a moment. It needed to change, she said. Yes, Webb said. It did. She left. Maya sat at the desk for a long time with the commendation in front of her, and the silence of the quarters around her, and the particular quality of late afternoon light through the window, the flat winter light of a season that had been running since before Christmas, and was now slowly, beginning to consider something else. She thought about Daniel Park. She'd sent him a message 2 weeks after Christmas, brief and encrypted, telling him enough that he would understand what had happened. He'd responded in 4 words again, different ones this time. Knew you'd find it. She thought about the 14-minute gap, the clean, deliberate absence of something that should have been there, the thing she'd sat with in the buzzing fluorescent light of the secondary intelligence annex and turned over and examined until she could see its edges clearly enough to name it. Noticing things wasn't a talent she'd chosen. It was just how she was made. The particular wiring that made the baseline visible, that made deviations from the baseline feel wrong before she could articulate why, that made the absence of data as loud as data itself. It had gotten her into trouble consistently since she was 26 years old. It had cost her a promotion, a commendation, a partner, and 2 months of restricted quarters on a FOB in a war zone. It had also kept 12 men alive on Christmas Eve. She picked up the commendation, put it in the top drawer of the desk. She picked up the card Cole had given her on the steps of the theater headquarters building. She set it on the desk in front of her where she could see it. 12 names. 12 numbers. She'd been alone in this for a long time. Alone by necessity, by circumstance, by the specific logic of a situation in which every channel available to her ran through the thing she was trying to expose. She had built the case alone and made the decision alone and gone to Blackridge District alone and come back alone. And the aloneness had been correct. Functionally, tactically, the only viable option given the constraints. It had also been the loneliest 6 months of her life. She looked at the card. She put it in her jacket pocket, over her chest, and left it there. 6 months later, on a base with a different name in a different part of the world, Maya Vance was reassigned to active duty. The unit was smaller than what she'd had before. The work was specific and quiet, and required exactly the skills that had made her chain of command uncomfortable for the better part of a decade. The assignment letter was brief and straightforward, and did not acknowledge the intervening period in any way, which was fine, because the period didn't need acknowledging by a letter. On her first day, she set up her position. It was an elevated space with good sight lines and clear angles, and the kind of structural quality that told her someone who understood the work had selected it. She went through the setup the way she always went through it. Methodical, unhurried, checking each element in the sequence that made the whole thing reliable. She pressed her eye to the scope. The picture resolved, clear and steady, the way a good scope made the world when everything was calibrated correctly. In her jacket pocket, against her chest, Cole's card. She hadn't called any of the numbers yet. She might not for a while. But she'd kept it there through 6 months of proceedings and temporary quarters and review boards and witness testimony and the long institutional process of a system working through what had happened inside it. She'd kept it there because it was 12 people who knew exactly what she'd done and had shown up anyway, and because that was a thing worth carrying. Halstead's trial concluded in September. She heard about it from Webb, who sent a brief message. Guilty on all counts, life, no parole. She read it once, put her phone away, went back to work. The 14 men connected to the Longbow network received sentences ranging from 8 years to life. The systemic review of the intelligence processing chain produced 17 structural recommendations, 11 of which were implemented within a year. The oversight mechanisms that had been, in practice, downstream of the command authority they were supposed to monitor were redesigned with genuine independence built into their architecture. The next person who noticed a gap in the data would have somewhere to take it. That mattered. It wasn't a clean ending. Clean endings belonged to a version of this story that didn't account for the soldiers whose names were in the gap, the operations that had run on corrupted intelligence, the families that had received folded flags and explanations that were true in the narrow factual sense and false in every sense that counted. Nothing that happened in proceedings and reviews and structural recommendations reached backward and changed any of that. But forward was the only direction available. Maya Vance understood that. She had understood it since the first moment she'd identified the first gap, in a room with a buzzing fluorescent light, with no authorization and no clear path and no certainty about where it led. Only the specific, unshakable conviction that the absence of something that should have been there was not acceptable, and that the person who was going to do something about it was the person currently looking at it. She settled behind her rifle. She exhaled slowly, halfway, and held it. And she watched. Some people are not remembered for following orders. They are remembered for knowing which orders were worth the cost of breaking them, and having the courage to pay that cost alone, in the dark, when no one was watching and no one had asked them to.